Before we get into today's topic, which can be somewhat heavy talking about financial trauma, I want to remind you that on this channel, I am not acting as your psychotherapist. I'm not providing mental health care advice. This is for entertainment purposes only, and I'm only going to be talking about the educational side of trauma and financial trauma. If you need mental health care, please make sure that you find it. I've put some resources in the description box below. With that, let's get into today's topic, which is what is financial trauma and do I have it? I'm Lindsay. I'm a clinical social worker and a financial therapist, and I've been hearing more and more about financial trauma over the past few years, and it seems like recently people are really interested in figuring out what it is and whether or not they have it. Let's start with what trauma is. I think that helps just to kind of give everybody a baseline of what we're talking about today. The DSM-5 defines trauma as an event or series of events where actual or threatened death, serious injury, or bodily harm happens. Now, not everybody who experiences trauma ends up with PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. I think it's fair to say that all of us have experienced trauma, especially when it comes to what we've gone through with the pandemic over the past few years. All of us have experienced exposure to serious death or harm. I don't say this to scare you or to fearmonger you. I just say it to say if you're feeling a little bit financially out of control or your nervous system feels like it can't relax, it makes perfect sense. We've all experienced so much over the past few years, and our money is not impacted by everything that's going on. Dr. Galen Buckwalter is one of the premier researchers on the topic of money and wellness and money and happiness and money and trauma. In 2016, the research institute Happy Money funded a study that found that most of us have experienced financial trauma. In general, 1 in 4 Americans have experienced financial trauma, but millennials in particular, it's higher at 1/3. When we think of trauma and then we layer on financial stuff, it makes sense that a lot of us would have experienced financial trauma because there are a lot of things that impact our sense of financial safety. Of course, things like the pandemic and recessions are impactful, but also things on a systemic level, such as who has access to the different types of benefits, impact our feeling of safety around money. And of these people who have endorsed feeling financial trauma, a lot of them have almost identical symptoms to clinical PTSD. In addition to some of the more money-centric behaviors like avoiding looking at their finances or reportedly hoarding money, there were also things like irritability, hypervigilance, irritation, self-destructive behavior, and isolation, things that we tend to see go hand in hand with post-traumatic stress disorder. I want to talk about where financial trauma comes from, what some of the symptoms are when it comes to our money, and how we can deal with it if we feel like we have financial trauma. There are so many different ways that we can have exposure to financial trauma. I mentioned earlier 2 big things, recession and the pandemic. Of course, having exposure to a recession, whether it's the first time or your second time, or maybe even your third time, lucky you, that can cause us to feel feelings of uncertainty or unease around the financial stability of our livelihoods. And that can cause a trauma style reaction. Similarly, the pandemic caused a lot of financial stress, from people losing jobs to having businesses shut down to people who are immunocompromised and are no longer able to do the types of work that they used to do. Another reason that people can develop financial trauma is from a business failing. So if you are an entrepreneur and you went out and you tried your darndest and your business didn't go the way that you were hoping that it would, of course, that can cause symptoms of financial trauma. Another reason that people can experience financial trauma is from a breakup or a divorce, especially when you're in a relationship where one person might significantly earn more than another person, or one person is more in charge of things like caregiving. The scales can be pretty imbalanced. And so leaving a relationship, even if it's the best thing to do with your physical, emotional, spiritual health, can be really hard on your finances. Another thing that can impact a person and cause them to experience financial trauma is the end of something like alimony or child support. If a person was regularly receiving something like alimony or child support and all of a sudden it stopped, say with child support, maybe it stopped when your kiddo was 12, not when they were 18, because the person who you shared a child with is no longer paying you. Of course, that's going to cause some sort of destabilization around your relationship to money. And systems issues are huge. Especially where I'm recording from in the US, we do not have a very strong social safety net, and that means a lot of people don't have the type of cushion that they may have in other places. We know how things like discrimination can impact a person's relationship with money. Chronic discrimination over years and years can absolutely make it so that somebody experiences financial trauma. Whether you're trying to apply for a job or a credit card or an apartment, and there are issues around your race, gender, religion, sexual orientation that might make it hard for you to get access to a credit or apartment or a job, that's going to cause financial trauma. Other systems issues are things like not being documented in the US. Not being documented can mean you don't have access to a lot of other things, and it can cause you to feel on edge if you're working at a job and you see somebody come in who you think might be related to immigration. That can cause a lot of stress and that can cause a lot of trauma. Other things include things like benefits running out. In the US, unemployment doesn't last that long. If you have cash benefits such as disability benefits, it can be a whole song and dance to not only get those disability benefits, but to make sure that you continue to get them year after year. It can be such a bureaucratic nightmare of trying to get a hold of somebody when you sent in the form and they tell you, actually, that fax number doesn't work. You have to come in person. Then we're thinking about things like transportation issues of getting to the building where you need to be in order to submit your benefits. There can be things like barriers, physical access barriers. There's so many things that make it really difficult just to get the types of basic human care that we are reportedly entitled to in this country. It can be a huge nightmare. And so for some people, they may even opt out of applying for things like food assistance, housing assistance, cash assistance, because the effort is so much more taxing than the potential benefit of having those things. And finally, the loss of somebody, the death of a family member can absolutely cause financial trauma. Now that I've gone through that list, my guess is most of us can see ourselves in one or in many of those categories. Now, just because a person has experienced trauma does not mean they will develop post-traumatic stress disorder. For example, if two people are in the exact same car accident, one person may be a little shaken up for a day or two, but they might not experience any residual impacts of that car accident. On the other hand, another person in that exact same car may go through that and experience things like nightmares, difficulty sleeping, avoidance of driving, not getting into cars. We know that that can be true. There are so many different factors that impact a person's ability to cope or not cope with a specific trauma. So even though most of us have been exposed to some sort of financial trauma, it doesn't mean all of us are going to develop the symptoms that come along with exposure to financial trauma. Some of the symptoms of financial trauma are avoiding your money, not opening bills, not looking at them, not checking to make sure that the amount that you said you wanted to go to taxes is actually going to taxes. It can feel incredibly overwhelming to deal with financial minutia. And so a lot of us just avoid it if we've been exposed to financial trauma. Overspending is another symptom of financial trauma. It sounds a little bit counterintuitive, but here's the way I want you to think of it. Most of us have enough empathy and compassion for a person who grew up and they were food insecure. We can imagine that a person who grew up food insecure might struggle when they are presented with food, in that they may overeat it, they may take more than they need and hide it. And we go, oh, it makes sense that they might hold on to that food or eat it right away because they're not really sure where their next meal is going to come from. But when we experience something like growing up in a household that is incredibly financially insecure, we don't tend to extend the same compassion to them if money comes their way, right? There's a lot of judgment around what people who have lower incomes can or should do with their money. There's a lot of judgment around they shouldn't have nice TVs, they shouldn't have phones, they shouldn't have good sneakers because it's wasteful, right? We pile a lot of judgment on people for that versus acknowledging that if they were in a financially insecure household, it makes sense that when money comes, they aren't sure when they're going to get more money. So they might use it right away by buying that TV, by buying more groceries than they can safely eat in a week, by treating a friend or a family member to dinner. When we think of overspending from that lens, it makes so much more sense why a person might engage in those types of behaviors if they have that type of exposure to chronic underemployment or chronic lower earnings, and they grew up in a household like that. Another symptom is underspending. So similar to that food example, we might extend a lot of compassion to a person who is food insecure, who holds on to their food, who kind of stores their nuts for winter, so to speak. When it comes to financial trauma, some people are so fearful that they won't have more money coming in that they do what makes them feel safe and they hold on really tightly to their money. This is super common in households where they are or come from a family of immigrants or refugees or were religious asylees. If you have money readily available to you, it is quite literally a ticket out or a ticket towards safety. And we know that intergenerational trauma, the trauma of our ancestors, can be passed down to us between 5 and 14 generations. So even if maybe you didn't grow up feeling insecure financially, maybe your great grandparents did, and you find yourself holding on tightly to money. Another common symptom I see in financial trauma is financial enmeshment or codependency. Financial enmeshment and codependency is a type of dysfunctional relationship where one person is giving of money or potentially bailing somebody out of financial hardship again and again because they also get something out of it. And if you imagine, or you are a person who grew up experiencing chronic financial trauma, it makes sense that you might have people in your life who are only there in your mind's eye to help you when you are struggling financially, or maybe you were on the receiving end of that at some point in time. So you develop these relationships with people that are exclusively about giving and getting money. So you don't reach out to them to say, hey, how was your day? But you reach out to them in a panic and you're like, oh my gosh, my rent's due. I don't have any money. What am I going to do? And then with these enabling and codependent relationships, the person who is giving of that money tends to leverage some control over what they want that person to do. So they may say things like, yeah, I'll give you rent, but they're maybe expecting that you watch their kid multiple times a week, or maybe they're expecting that you come visit them more than you would prefer to, right? There's this kind of unhealthy dynamic around the giving and receiving of money that tends to get looped into financial trauma. How do we deal with financial trauma? Of course, as a therapist, if you're experiencing trauma and symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, I almost always am going to recommend some type of psychotherapy that can help you with trauma, such as trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, somatic therapy around trauma. Some people have found EMDR to be helpful. DR is another evidence-based type of psychotherapy that's been helpful for trauma. If therapy is not accessible to you or you're not interested in it, I have some ideas for you. Again, this is not mental health advice. This is just information. One, talk about it. Talk about it with a trusted friend, a trusted colleague, a trusted partner about what you're experiencing or what you're going through. Having the ability to verbally process things and to have somebody hold space for you is a great way to help move through that trauma. Two, educate yourself. This could be educating yourself on the symptoms of trauma and why you might be experiencing some of those trauma response behaviors, or it might be educating yourself on how to better manage your money in a way that doesn't feel so scary or so overwhelming. Three, practice self-care. Find ways to soothe your nervous system. I know self-care is like, induces an eye roll for a lot of people, but we have to take care of ourselves. And particularly when we're trying to push back against some of those symptoms of financial trauma, we have to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves mentally, physically, and spiritually. We want to make sure that we are regularly practicing ways to nurture ourselves and practice self-care. I have an entire video of 37 different ways you can practice financial self-care if you need some tips. Four is set healthy boundaries, especially if you fall into the symptom category of enmeshed or codependent relationships. Setting up a boundary with the person who you're giving or getting money from can be really important. And it's also really hard. It's really hard to change the relational dynamics that have been established. A couple of ideas I have when it comes to setting financial boundaries is potentially putting up a time limit, particularly if you're the one giving money. So saying something like, I'm happy to help you out with rent for the next 3 months, but after that, I'm no longer able to help financially, right? That gives them the idea of, okay, I can ask Lindsay for help for a few more months, but then after that, I have to figure out a way to get this need met on my own. Another idea is to set some limits around what type of financial support you will provide them. Maybe you're super comfortable helping out with groceries, but you're not really helpful helping out with extracurriculars or vice versa. Set that boundary and let them know that that's where you're at. So that's if you're on the giving end. If you're on the receiving end, it can be really hard to say, hey, I actually don't want any more financial help. But sometimes we need to do that, especially if we're in toxic or unhealthy relationships with the person who is giving us money. So a way to go about doing this is to acknowledge the gratitude for the financial help that the family member or friend has provided for you, and let them know that you're trying to move away from that type of support. So you could say to them, I so appreciate how you've helped out with gas money and groceries lately. I'm working really hard on being able to meet my own needs. I would love for you I'm really going to try hard to not ask for financial help in the future. But if I find myself in a financial bind, I would love it if you could help me kind of navigate the community resources that are available, right? You can set boundaries on both sides of that enmeshed or codependent financial relationship. And number 5 is to reduce shame. Financial guilt and shame are different. Guilt is external. I did something bad. I made a mistake. Whereas shame is internal. I am bad. I am that mistake. I'm bad with money. So, in order to reduce shame, talking about it can help to reduce shame. Educating yourself can help to reduce shame. Finding other people in your community who you can talk money with can help reduce shame. And also making meaning of why you did what you did can help to reduce shame. What I mean by that is instead of saying, oh my gosh, I've been avoiding my bills forever. I'm so stupid. What's wrong with me? I want you to acknowledge why you might have been avoiding those bills in the first place by extending to yourself some empathy, some compassion, saying something like, oh, Lindsay, it makes sense that you avoided looking at your bills because for so many years, bills were associated with tension, with hardship, with frustration, and with struggle. Even though you're no longer in a financially precarious situation, it makes sense that your brain would try and protect you from that by avoiding looking at those bills. We're making meaning of the behaviors that we did because we're extending ourselves empathy and compassion. This isn't about just saying like, oh, be nice to yourself and don't change. We have to do behavior change along with it. So in order to really make meaning of a financial mistake, we have to acknowledge why we did it, why our behaviors were probably there to protect us, and what we're going to do differently. Maybe if the behavior was bill avoidance, the thing we could do differently is to say, I'm going to sit down for 2 hours uninterrupted and put all of my bills on auto pay. That way, if I get into that avoidance state, I at least know my bills are going to be taken care of. Of course, this is kind of just scratching the surface of trauma and financial trauma. Again, I cannot reiterate it enough. If you need help coping with trauma or financial trauma, please find a qualified healthcare professional to help you with that. This is just information. And with that, I'll see you in the next video.